Good morning, everyone. Good morning, everybody. It's so nice to see all of you. We have been moving back from COVID, and so we're still kind of getting used to doing forums in person. So last season, we did a lot of forums online and some in person, but it is really, really good to have everybody back here for this occasion today. My name is Malcolm Young. I'm the Dean of the Cathedral, and it's a blessing for us to be together, especially to study this topic. Awe is a mysterious emotion. How do we begin to quantify the goosebumps we feel when we see the Grand Canyon, or the utter amazement when we watch a child walk for the first time? How do you put into words the collective joy of standing in a crowd and singing in unison, or the wonder you feel gazing at centuries-old works of art, or even a much younger cathedral? What can we and science teach us about the fundamental human experience of awe? Dacher Keltner is a foremost expert on the science of emotions, a professor of psychology at the University of California, Berkeley, and the faculty director of the UC Berkeley Greater Good Science Center. He was a consultant to Pixar's film Inside Out and is the author of the best-selling book Born to be Good, The Science of a Meaningful Life, and The Compassionate Instinct. Today, we're going to talk about his new book, Awe, the new science of everyday wonder and how it can transform your life, and how much we need this elusive emotion. Dacher, thank you so much for joining me today.
It's good to be with you, Malcolm.
Yeah, I've been looking forward to this so much. When they told me I was going to be the Dean of Grace Cathedral, it wasn't long after I finished reading your book, about goodness.
Yeah.
And so one of the first thoughts I had is, oh, now Dacher can come and be on the forum. So I'm glad you're finally here.
Yeah.
And what a perfect topic for us. What led you to begin studying emotions? How did your career path kind of bring you into that orbit?
Yeah, it's interesting. Psychological science is 120, 130 years old, and we were very late to study human emotion, in part because of methodologically, it's hard to capture them. They seem ineffable, hard to describe. I also think that there was a cultural bias against the emotions, that they're gendered, if you will, they're irrational and so forth. And so it took a while to get to study human emotion, but I was long interested in them because I was raised in a really emotional household. And my mom taught romanticism and poetry and William Blake and D.H. Lawrence and Virginia Woolf. My dad was a painter. I grew up in the late 60s in Laurel Canyon. It was just emotion everywhere.
Oh, yeah.
And, to enter into a science in the late 80s where they literally had nothing to say about the passions, even though people from all kinds of cultural traditions have been writing about them for millennia, it was wide open, right? And then I got to it because of a San Franciscan, Paul Ekman, who had really devoted his career to measuring emotion in the face. And that was really this clarion call to young scientists that, you can go anywhere in the world and you can study awe or compassion or shame. And it was a tremendous invitation. So it's been 30 years of discovery.
What surprised you when you first started studying the emotions? What were some of the early breakthroughs in terms of your own thinking about, that part of human life?
I think I think the central notion that surprised me, it's really two ideas. One is a lot of people have thought of emotions as irrational and dysfunctional. And I think there are a lot of cultural implications that flow out of that idea when you think about pharmaceuticals and medication and the like. And they're not at all. Emotions have a profoundly deep rationality. They help humans adapt to the world. We can talk about that. The best version of that, very relevant here, is the role of emotion in your spiritual commitments. John Haidt's made a lot of progress, the role of emotion in your moral judgments, right? Look at politics. And politics are driven by people's commitments through emotion. And the second idea that I'm still captivated by, and it's a Darwin idea. Darwin wrote about emotions, loved the emotions, took 30 years to write a book that he published in 1872. But it's really a phrase from Irenaeus Abelsfeld, who's this German ethologist who just studied people in their natural habitats around the world, small-scale societies, and he said, emotions are the grammar of social life. They are the structure of our social living. If you feel shame, it's a signal and it's a role of how I fit in this world. And so that tells us that emotions aren't these irrational, bursts of consciousness. They are the deep structure of life. And so I think science is starting to get there, and we got a lot of work to do.
Yeah, I mean, in a way, if you think of it's a movement from looking at human beings as primarily individuals to
Right.
being part of a social life.
Exactly, yeah. And, Western scientific approaches to the mind have been so individualistic, and once you start to think about emotions and their contagion and how we share them reflexively, it's like it is a collective phenomena. And raises a lot of interesting questions for you.
Definitely. We're working in the same field. So, if you had to give advice to somebody about how to be happier from what you've learned, just based on your studies, where should we begin in terms of making our own lives happier? And then also, how do we create kind of social structures which kind of encourage happiness?
Yeah, it's funny. I've taught happiness to literally probably several 100,000 people online and at Berkeley and different venues, and I wasn't a very happy child, so it doesn't make sense. I was kind of grouchy, but...
I think that makes you perfect for it.
Yeah, I'm the skeptic. To me, and I get that question all the time, how do we find happiness? Coming out of the pandemic, worldwide, there's a 30% rise in depression and anxiety, and we're probably feeling it. You're feeling it in your own life, in your kids, and so forth. I can tell you, in looking at the literature, one is, find a contemplative approach to hardship and suffering, be it, spiritual tradition or mindfulness or, walking outdoors. I privilege a lot, just like find your favorite positive emotions and go after them. Be it gratitude or compassion. And then, what I write about in this book, I think awe is this basic state of mind that we've lost sight of in a lot of ways. And it's everywhere to be found, and go find awe. And awe brings you to this new area of inquiry and happiness, which is meaning, right? I can enjoy wine, I can enjoy the burrito that I love and the sun on my skin, but there's also the meaning that we seek in life of what it's all about, what you teach. Yeah. And awe is a good pathway, so I usually give advice like that or make suggestions.
Well, I think it's great advice. I think it's so easy to just kind of get wrapped up in things that aren't important or that are important in a certain sphere, and not to think about the overall connection between us and the world and us and God. Yeah. So it is really...
Yeah, and thanks for bringing that up, Malcolm. I mean, one of the things that the science of awe teaches us is as the poet Ross Gay nicely says, these boundaries between one another are very porous, and they're a construct of the mind that we're separate from each other. And awe brings into an awareness how hyper-connected we are. And so that's always what I tell people, like find a couple of connections that are really meaningful to you.
How do you define awe, and then how do you begin to measure it? Because I know that there have been just scientific breakthroughs in terms of just the methodologies and the equipment we have for studying human behavior. Yeah. Maybe you can talk a little bit about that.
Yeah. So, it's such an interesting irony in writing this book because, and I had the privilege of talking to my first conversation about spiritual awe or mystical awe was with Malcolm, who really oriented me in that inquiry. It's an irony because awe is really about encountering vast mysteries. It's the feeling you have when you encounter something vast that you don't understand. Wonder is often conflated or confused with awe, but it is a mental state that follows awe, right? Wow, how do I figure this out? it's interesting because I think one of the reasons we hadn't studied awe scientifically until 12 years ago, really, is there's this feeling that you can't describe it, you can't put it to words, how dare you measure it? I was at a talk the other day where somebody was like, well, the tyranny of measurement. I'm like, what are you talking about? And science is making a lot of progress in measuring awe, and it's amazing. And it's useful because people often come up to me and they're like, oh, you study awe? So I had this experience where I was in the redwoods, and I saw the light, and I saw my daughter take her first steps, and I'm weeping and crying and shouting to God. Is that awe? I'm like, definitely awe. Yeah. And because I can give people a checklist, right? Like science has shown, when you feel awe, you feel smaller. You literally, like, we did a study at Yosemite where we asked people to draw themselves, and they compared to Fisherman's Wharf, and at Yosemite they draw themselves really small, because you get small around God or the trees. You feel quiet. You may vocalize. You may go, whoa. That's the most universal emotion sound around the world. You want to, what William James, I know I teased you in the book, he carried William James' variety of religious experience around in college.
I have a picture of me and my best friend. We're going on a vacation, and there's me holding William James.
Yeah, I'm sure he had a lot of dates.
Right.
Yeah, so.
Exactly.
Well, that was so, I got to give you a high five on that one. That was just like, because he sent me the photo. Yeah. So I got that photo. So I tried to get in the book, but they didn't.
That's okay.
So awe, this just freaks me out, right? We get special kinds of tears when we feel awe. Who's had those tears? Yeah. Just like, right? And it's parasympathetic autonomic nervous system, which is about engaging with others without boundaries. And then my favorite, and I could talk about the brain, but is the goosebumps. And there's a specific kind of chills that runs up your arms and your back, like at music. Laura Encera is here, right? Who gave me the chills with her musical performances. And that actually is a mammalian response. Social mammals, you can divide mammals into more social ones, rats, primates, humans, less social ones, cats, and so on. Not kidding. And the social mammals all fluff up their fur when they merge with other friends in their group. So the chills you get with awe, which you can measure, with different techniques like the goose cam, actually is a physiological response that's mammalian. That's when I lean into Malcolm to say, let's figure out the mystery together, right? Which is remarkable, how deep it is in mammalian. So there are a lot of ways in which we know. I can answer that question now. That's all, right?
Yeah, I've had an experience of a few times I've just like run out on a run, I'm exhausted, and I come across someone and we have some kind of like interaction, like, hi, how's it, or something, and I feel this explosion off the back of my head all the way around, and it's you're right, it's a physiological response to encountering a person in a certain state of awe already, and it kind of it supercharges it.
Yeah, and it raises, Jane Goodall believed that chimpanzees have awe. She observed a chimp, I write about it, showing a waterfall. They get very quiet and humble, and they fluff up their fur around waterfalls, big storms, like we do. And she said, this is the beginnings of awe, and maybe even primate spirituality.
Yeah, I almost got killed by awe this last winter, because, the storms are so huge. I couldn't help but go into the forest, and, the wind is in the trees, and the branches are falling everywhere.
He's an awe seeker, by the way.
Awe can be dangerous.
Yeah,
now that we talk about awe seeking, one of the things you say in the book is, just on average, people experience awe 3 to 4 times a week.
Yeah.
You talk about people who experience awe every day,
and
how there's kind of things that make them different.
Yeah.
What makes people different who are people who just like, I haven't ever experienced awe, versus people who are those kind of awe seekers, or are experiencing it more frequently?
It's such a deep question. Everything has individual variability. So if you talk about awe, there's always people who don't feel it, people who feel it, like Malcolm, 10, 12 times an hour, and which is true. And one thing that I'm really excited about is you can train up awe. You can cultivate it. We're developing a lot of practices and awe walks and awe stories and the like. And that we find leads people to feel more awe on a regular basis. We did a awe walk study with people in San Francisco, 75 years old or older. We had them just go out and find awe once a week. And over the course of the 8 weeks, their awe increased over time. So this is an emotion that doesn't need you to hop on a plane and go to the Grand Canyon. You can find it everywhere. It's a basic state of mind. So we can cultivate it through spiritual practice, contemplative practice, music, yoga, etc. It's easy to cultivate. And then it's very fascinating, the physiological side, the biological evolution side. There is a particular, what we call a genetic polymorphism on the 4th chromosome. It's a variation of a dopamine gene. And dopamine is often misinterpreted in the literature. People think it's pleasure, but it's actually exploration. And that's different, right? You're just fascinated with the new. Yeah. And people who have this particular genetic variation have higher levels of dopamine, and they feel a lot more awe, right? And they're kind of the explorer types in the human spectrum. They just were always looking for new and finding awe. So there are a lot of reasons why we vary.
Yeah, that's fascinating. So you've studied awe in 26 cultures, and you've seen ways in which it's universal, and you've seen ways in which it's particular. Can you talk a little bit about what you learned from doing awe research cross-culturally?
It's so deep. And I think that it was really the William James intuition that you and I talked about, Malcolm, of like the mystical forms of experience, the transcendent experiences, are both totally personal and culturally specific and human and universal. And so we, and that was kind of part of the Jamesian enterprise in studying mysticism. I got really frustrated with, we were trying to figure out awe, and I've given you, there are brain patterns, vocalizations, and it didn't really capture the spirit of awe, right? Of what the structure of meaning is when you encounter vast mysteries. And so in the spirit of William James, we gathered stories of awe from 26 countries. Mexico and Brazil and the US and Canada and China and Japan and India and parts of Africa, all over, every kind of culture that you might be interested in. And I think there are a couple things that are really striking, which is it's the most common source of awe is moral beauty. Yeah. And that surprised us. It's like your encounter with that individual, just like, God, look at humans. We're here together. We suffer. We love. We have compassion. And it just moves us to awe. And around the world, kindness, courage, people's overcoming was the kind of deep universal to awe. And there are these other wonders you should know about that I write about of, collective movement, nature, of course, music, art, spirituality, and then big ideas in life and death were the 8 wonders. And then cultures vary. It's really striking. In China, which we've done a lot of work in, awe is really about the reverence for people in positions of authority, right? Of like teachers. Yeah. They revere their teachers in China. US, good luck, Try teaching 8th grade and see if you see a lot of reverence in that classroom, So there are these really fundamental differences. We have found in places of deep inequality, awe has a lot of fear and subordination in it, right? So if you're in a more hierarchical culture like Japan, it's just much more fear-imbued, and you're worried about social ostracism. Yeah. So it's always the story, right? There are these deep universals, and then stunning variations. I have to tell you, in the United States, in one study with college students, 9% of their awe experiences were about themselves. They were like, I got this fellowship, I've got this photo on Tinder, check this out, it's awesome, you know. And I was like, you know, so you've got work to do.
We do.
Yeah.
You know, I'm glad you brought that up about the technologies too, and I wonder if you can talk a little bit about what effect, you know, these cell phone technologies, the social media, like what effect does that have on our experience of awe?
Yeah. Well, I have Soren Gorhammer out here who does Wisdom 2.0, who is using technology to bring awe to people. But you know, as we poured over these 2,600 stories from around the world, we had speakers of 20 languages at UC Berkeley, which is a very diverse university, translate them. And we were just pouring over these stories. I've read them many times. No one mentioned Meta or Facebook as a source of awe. No one mentioned a Google search. No one mentioned Google Maps, or no one mentioned their smartphone. Technology, I believe, is the antithesis of awe for the most part. The current social technologies. Soren is different. He brings people together in contemplation in his work at Wisdom 2.0. And I think that's a challenge, right? Don't get me going on virtual reality. I think it's a joke. It'll do some things, but most of it is. And so I think we've been misled, and we need real community.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's, I use this analogy all the time. I talk about the invention of the printing press, or movable type in Europe. I mean, it had these huge effects for people to have access to being able to read the Bible, but it also is the reason why you found out who was a witch. You're like, oh, now the witch, okay, long hair, check. I mean, so you take these regional things, and you make them international, and it has horrible effects. And
that's interesting. So it's the problem of scale.
Scale and learning how to use it.
Yeah.
So I mean, I think when you're in the first generation, to see an actual piece of paper that has the description of what a witch is, then it's really different than when you're 3 centuries later and you're reading the New York Times and an editor has gone through everything and you're like, oh, there's journalistic standards. I mean, you have to learn how to use the technologies.
Yeah, and it's funny, you know, I was talking with my colleague Yuri Saluda, my collaborator, about how awe and the sacred and the spirit maybe needs collective gathering, right? And technology moves us away from that. Everything has become so individualized, ironically. I was at a dance party recently where they had the innovative technological idea where everybody would wear headphones and dance to their own music. That's not dance. It was ridiculous, you know, so, but it was, and maybe that's part of the problem.
Yeah, part of the learning, too.
Yeah.
You know, I loved reading the sections where you described the different religious leaders that you met. And I wondered if you could talk a little bit about what surprised you in those conversations.
Thank you. I'm just thinking about our conversation.
Yeah. I can shut my eyes. I see us right where we're sitting and everything.
So, you know, one of the things that happens when you write a book, on something like awe, which is so humbling, and I do science and quantitative stuff and physiological measurement, and you're immediately like, there were 2 realms I really did not know about. Music, which is still a deep mystery, I think a really huge mystery, and fascinating, and spirituality. And so, you know, there it was, it's a deep human universal. Robert Wright, whom I really admire, you know, all cultures have a sense of the divine. You cannot find a human culture that does not have a sense of the divine. So it's in our DNA, if you will. And so I called up Malcolm. And Malcolm, you know, and I was really nervous, frankly, for that interview. I came out of a kind of a social justice type family that critiqued religion from a feminist lens. You know, that's kind of where, you know, I stopped and had flirted with, you know, I've always been interested in spirituality. I got thrown out of my first meditation class. I'm not good at it, you know. So Malcolm and I talked, and, you know, we got to, like, the deep questions, and I'll never forget. You said, like, I'm not interested in definitions, you know, God, afterlife, heaven, hell, you know. I'm interested in the moment of sacred connection, you know, in your work. And that was just, and space. You had this spatial metaphor that was very interesting of like, this is awe right here, right? And then I went to Reverend Jen Bailey, who's African-American, a minister, got a sense of African-American religion. I talked to Dr. Uriah Salidwin and indigenous spiritual traditions, which really expand our ideas about mystical states deeply. And then went to a retreat in India with where the most moving part, it was at Gandhi's ashram, and I went with my daughter Serafina and then had this retreat, and there's a service organization that's Bay Area, Nipun Mehta, who's another Berkeley grad, just like you, right, who I'm very proud to call a bear, and it's all about service. And I talked to these two sisters, Swara and Trupti, who do these Gandhi walks, where they walk 1,000 miles with no money, and it's just like free-form spirituality, and just discovering God in rivers and generosity, and I have this experience at the end where, it opened my mind to what's this quantum space of connectivity that I would call divine.
Yeah, and I think one of the things I most appreciate about your work is just what you just described, that moral courage, that human excellence in kindness and morality and love, that how powerful that is for moving us.
Yeah, and for somebody who's a scientist and reads all the atheists, and to just go into, because that's what your experience was. Each experience was about, God, people are so generous. I walk through India, these two sisters, and they just open their cupboards reflexively. There's so much courage and kindness out there to profile. So it was an incredible experience to think about spirituality.
Yeah. One of the things I've been thinking a lot about is just, its connection to politics too.
Yeah.
So I wonder what you have to say about that. I mean,
that's one of the critique I always get is like, what about the dark side? And awe is politicized, and it's interesting, Malcolm, if you don't mind my saying, it was so striking to me that you were, you ended up living by Emerson's.
Oh yeah, I lived 2 doors down from where they gave the Divinity School, on the same floor that Emerson lived in, but he lived on the other. I was so lucky. Every day I meditated in the chapel where Emerson gave the Divinity School address.
And what did that mean to you, that address?
It was profound. But you quoted sections from Nature, and his essay on nature too has just had a huge impact on my thought and how I live.
And there are all these forces that try to I think real awe can't be commodified. It has to be emergent and human. And part of the dark side of awe is the commodification of it. One of my favorite examples is the Marvel rooms. European aristocracy gathered all this stuff, species and artifacts and sacred objects from around the world. Look at my Marvel room, it's bigger than your Marvel room. And then you're in trouble, right? Politics commodifies awe. Trump's, as Dave Eggers wrote, Dave Eggers went through Trump rallies when everybody was writing him off, and he's like, uh-oh, the Democrats are in trouble. And it was awe, right? It was like he would show up and electrify, and progressive didn't understand it. And so it is politicized. And the reason I bring up Emerson and my conversation with Malcolm got me to Emerson is his Divinity School speech said, don't commodify the sacred. Let humans find it. Let us find it together. And so I think I do worry about the politicization. And, now, I'm not kidding, but I just got hey, would you join me in a movement, the awe economy? I'm like, and I was driving somewhere in California, and I see, the awe spa. And I was like, oh, so it could be trouble, as it always is in this great capitalist nation.
Completely. We take that's what human nature, to take something that's good and just kind of, alter it. But yeah, Emerson in that Divinity School address, he talks about the preacher just in the church, just seeming like so distant from the actual concerns of the people he's talking to. And he said, outside there's a blizzard, and the blizzard and the snowfall seems so real, and the preacher seems so fake.
Yeah.
I'll never forget that.
Yeah. And Malcolm's story of his spirituality begins in a lake, or looking at the light on the lake, which really was powerful for me.
One of the things I absolutely love about the book, and I mean, it must be a very hard thing for you, is just the connection that your brother makes throughout the whole book. And when we talked in person, I immediately called my brother as soon as we came out of the restaurant. And then when I was reading your book, I called him a lot. Maybe you can talk a little bit about just what the proximity of death means for awe, and then also there are people who are going to be watching this who are in the process of either dying themselves or have a close loved one who's going to die soon. Maybe you can help us how we talk to people about awe.
Yeah, it's one of my biggest hopes with this book. My brother died 3 years ago, Rolf Keltner, and he and I had amassed this science of awe, and I was probably going to write the book 3 years from now. Wasn't quite ready, and watching him kind of fade from colon cancer, which was horror. I mean, that is a horrifying disease. And it's like an American medicine, as good as it does some things, it doesn't handle, how we move towards death. And I wasn't raised religious, didn't have any understanding of, no thoughts about the afterlife. And so my brother and I, we did every awe-inspiring thing together. We wandered hills and swam in rivers and went to protests and dances in Mexico and psychedelics and just everything, It was, and we just had this. And I was talking to my mom about it last night. They raised us to be children of awe, and to the present day, he was that. He passed the night that he passed away, which is where the book starts. Kind of. I knew he was going to die. He and I had talked a lot about it, or just like prepared, did the right things. And I go up there, and we're all around him. We start touching him. He had taken an end-of-life cocktail to end his life. And it was all mystery and awe. Just like you talked about, of like being near birth and ceremonies and dying, it's just mystery. That's all it is. It's mystery. And I felt awe. I just felt like space was expanding, and there were forces I didn't understand, and light was touching us, and it was interesting because at about that time, our science was finding that the life-death cycle is a law of nature, and it's a law of the universe, right? And it's a law of spirituality. Of this all starts and ends, right? It's a central law in evolutionary science, which is what I study, and Darwin thought about it all the time. And so there I was, and we had discovered in our 26-country research that people feel awe about dying, about their own death, in near-death, the new science of near-death experiences, watching other people go. It's sacred. And so it taught me, and that really led me to write this book, frankly. I was blown off the map, like a lot of grieving people was, like Joan Didion writes about, a Berkeley grad. I couldn't make sense of the world. So I had to make sense of the world. And it taught me this has to be part of our conversation about life, is its end, and awe and mystery. There is no, for most of us in this room, you can't really define a definitive answer. And what I'm excited about, talking about awe, there's a guy, Jim, who came to one of my workshops, and he's teaching awe to people who are dying and grieving.
Yeah.
Like, this is mysterious. And all of the great traditions have grappled with that. So, and it taught me not only the pragmatics of let's bring this into our conversation about death. Most cultures do it a lot better, but also to embrace mystery. This is one of the big mysteries.
Yeah.
And what do you think?
Well, we have this wonderful member of the congregation. His name's Norwood, and he was part of with the Bill Graham, the Ken Kesey, the acid test, all that stuff from back then. And you'd look at him, you wouldn't have any idea. But he got a terrible medical diagnosis, and he came to me and he's like, "I'm about to embark on the greatest adventure ever." Mm-hmm. And it turned out a month later, they're like, "Oh, the tests were wrong. You're okay." but it was almost like he didn't know what to do with that.
Yeah.
He was ready to embark on that adventure. And I think it's important to share those stories.
I agree.
Of people who are embarking on the adventure.
Yeah, and in the book, there is a new science of near-death experiences that is truly it's rigorous, it's got a lot of good measurement, and most people turn to it as an adventure, a soul-opening adventure, and that gave me enormous comfort. It was interesting, that science, as I watched my brother really fade those last few weeks, he entered into this state of curiosity.
Yeah, and it's hard to describe, but being with people who are dying, most people are ready.
Yeah.
There's something about us that is preparing.
Yeah.
And I don't even know how to put it in a way that makes more sense than that.
And what's that like for you to watch that?
It makes when something happens, when someone dies suddenly, or if they're fighting and screaming into the end, it makes those moments stand out even more. Yeah. So we had an 18-year-old girl who overdosed on drugs, and being there with her that was horrifying.
Yeah.
But like I said, most people are ready. They're prepared.
Yeah. And I agree. We need more sort of intentional practice around this.
Yeah, so. Exactly. That's exactly right. One of the things that we do that you may have forgotten is we take questions for the audience, and so Rebecca will collect your note cards, and then I'll read them. I brought my glasses, so I'll be able to see them this time. The pandemic was just, you mentioned it earlier, just being such a traumatic experience. One of my experiences in the pandemic was it was illegal to surf in Northern California for just a short time. But what it meant was that everybody else wasn't surfing. And so I remember these perfect days where the surf was perfect and everybody else was busy worrying about dying. And I was in the water at Ocean Beach. So I remember these moments of awe in the pandemic that were really. But I wonder if you can talk about how the pandemic kind of changed our orientation to awe, or if it did.
Yeah, I think that it. I wish I had data on that. It hurt people in terms of their awe.
Yeah.
That's pretty clear. We have a bit of data on that from healthcare providers and ordinary citizens. In large part, and this is so interesting. It's so good to be in physical company together. The pandemic knocked that out.
Yeah, it did.
And that takes out the structure, our sociality of almost every good thing we do. And I think it sharpened our awareness of certain things. There were historic numbers of people who used hiking trails in the national parks eventually. So that was augmented. And I think there's a hunger for awe right now. Yeah. It was a moment to say, what did I lose that's sacred, and how can I go find it again?
Yeah.
So I've sensed that in the reception to the book, that people are like, let's build awe into I just got called by Jim Henson, like they're going to make some Awe Muppets. So there we go.
That's great. If you inspire the creation of new Muppets, you're doing something.
I'm done. I know. I'm like, I go.
Tell us what Steve Kerr taught you about awe.
Oh man, yeah, I know.
So Steve Kerr is the Warriors basketball coach.
He is.
Kind of a local legend.
Put it right there.
Yeah, love the guy.
He's a basketball player. So I'm blown off the map. My brother's gone. I don't know where to find awe. Literally, in my grief, I hear this phrase. I heard a lot of things in grief, which is interesting, just the sensory experience. Find awe, right? And I just started calling people, Malcolm, And I've been lucky to be friends with the Golden State Warriors coaching staff and hang out with Steve Kerr a bit, whom I deeply admire, and talk about awe. Like if you're a basketball player, when you're on the court, I don't know. This probably won't appeal to many of you, but you're a basketball player.
Yes, completely.
7-foot human beings are awe-inspiring, And even the security who hangs around the Warriors, I'm like, what's it? Because they do the Raiders too, and I'm like, what's the difference? And they're like, football players are kind of like you and me. Basketball players are different, and they are. They walk off, and they're just like, they're huge. Steve Kerr is 6'4", so he's probably an inch bigger than you or two. He's a big guy, but he's tiny.
He's tiny.
Yeah, he is. But Steve Kerr, his whole, and he and I talked for an hour. I couldn't believe it. I'm like, I got his assistant. He's like, okay, Steve wants to talk to you. I'm like, whoa. And he grew up on the UCLA basketball campus. Near where
John Wooden,
I grew up near that campus.
Yeah, completely. I love it down there. I used to live there too.
Yeah, and John Wooden their basketball is transcendent. It's a transcendent sport, as all sports are. Sports is a great source of awe. We can talk about that. Underappreciated, especially in the Bay Area. Sports awe? No way. But Kerr, it was fascinating. His dad was a political scientist at UCLA, professor, and was killed. And it blew Steve Kerr off the map. And so death, to your last comment, and that experience is everywhere in his psyche, right? Life's so sacred, it's fleeting, people you love go, and it's just in his being. And for him, it was interesting. He talked about a basketball game where UCLA won by 1 point, and he just had this awe experience. Sports is awesome. Who's had an awe experience at a sporting event? Yeah. Come on, raise your hands, get them up there, And we diminish it, but it's very real. And Urias Salidwan reminded me of actually the oldest sporting events are the ball court games throughout Mesoamerica, 3,200 archaeological sites. About 3,000 years old, probably older. So Kerr talks about sports awe, but he's like a poet historian, and it's like he's like seeing light, hearing sounds, movements of players, but for him, basketball is the dissolving of boundaries.
Yeah, that's
and
right.
Everywhere he goes, people come up to him and they're like, his grandparents started an orphanage during the Armenian genocide. And Armenians come up to him crying and like, this is great, but your grandparents. So for him, it is this, what we all need, what we got to find, like a social venue to find this great emotion.
Yeah, and it's interesting because I can imagine him in some ways having to kind of step out of the awe that we're all experiencing at a game because he's got to someone's got to tend it. Someone's got to be kind of in charge of making sure everything's
but if you watch him, like if you go to a game, and every now and then I get to be close to the team, like the Warriors fans, I'm not sure if it's happened. I hope it happens in the Chase Arena. But over in Oakland, man, when they start playing well, magical scoring runs, everybody starts dancing. Like they all pop up and everybody's like, poof, doing their stuff. And you watch Kerr, and he's always looking around at the crowd. Yeah. And when I asked him, I was like, sorry to go on about this. Malcolm and I are basketball players, and he's dunked. I could never dunk, so there we go. But I was like, I asked his assistant coach, it's such an interesting idea too, what's the key to the Warriors? And the coach was like, movement. Movement. And I was like, oh, that's cool. It's not an analytic, it's a...
Yeah, right.
And then I asked Steve Kerr, I was like, how do you know you're playing well? He's like, I know we're playing well when the fans are dancing.
I love that. That's great. Okay, so here's our first question. Thank you. How can we as Westerners learn from the reverence that indigenous peoples have for the spirit dream world? Great question.
Can we bring Urias lead with us? Maybe do you want to provide a thought? Or I'll say a collaborator, we're doing work on indigenous transcendent experiences around the world. She has a book coming out. Maybe she'll come back. What would you say to that question? Her.
I think reverence definitely needs to be imbued by our experience, collective experience of Mother Earth, and really going back to those roots.
Yeah.
Expands our idea of kin. Like start really sensing how we belong to a larger web of responsive nature that makes us part of a system.
Right.
We realize that the misunderstanding or delusion of humans being atomic, isolated beings is just that. It's a story that has been imposed upon us, but in reality we are connected, relational beings that can, by our experiences of collectiveness, awaken to the possibility of reverence, of life, of spirit.
So do you want to summarize just for the microphone?
Yeah, seriously, try summarizing that. But it's an irony, like I'm in the meditation world, we teach it, right? 99% of studies of meditation and 99% is solitary individuals about themselves. And I think Yuria, we're collaborating on the question of indigenous contemplative approaches to the ecstatic and awe. It's about social stuff, and then it's about how you're connected to nature. And those have been lost in the contemplative approaches that are very popular right now, the Western interpretations of Buddhism and the like. It's all about, and I teach this, and I'm embarrassed, like, all right, let's meditate, focus on your breath, now focus on you, focus on your bank account, or whatever it is, and we've got to challenge that. And I will say, the science of music and awe is mind-blowing, because the minute babies hear music, everybody in the group is like moving to the same rhythm. Their brains are at the same pattern of activation. Their physiologies are the same. So Yuria's idea of like challenging this idea we're separate, awe is a good pathway to that. As a spiritual.
The word kinship was probably like the word that stuck out the most for me. But even the Book of Common Prayer is the book that we use to order worship. Common means what we do together. So there is a part when we're praying together, we're breathing together, when we're singing together, we're stopping. We're doing something that kind of unifies us. And that's definitely part of it. Okay, next question. How do psychedelics contribute to awe and in death and dying?
I always get a psychedelic question. So, I think, we always have to remember the indigenous sources of psychedelics, their cultural traditions, and worry about the economic exploitation of that, which I worry about profoundly, because psychedelics, we have a center at Berkeley. But the upside is, to me, is people facing trauma or really anxiety-producing news of death, or you're a veteran, and psychedelics are huge in the veterans community, and there's a whole underground. I've worked with a couple of veterans on this, and they are there's a mounting hypothesis, I think, that it's awe and ecstasy and transcendent states that psychedelics produces through neurophysiological processes we're just beginning to understand. Wow, all my concerns are just part of a big human experience. That helps people with death who are facing terminal disease, veterans, drug addictions, and the like. That's been well documented, and so that's good news. And I think awe will be a big part of the story. I write about it a little. And then Peter Hendricks is really championing, and David Yaden, that it's about this pathway to the transcendent. And then Michael Pollan tells a fascinating story about how these particular chemicals emerged in plants used by cultures to get us to the transcendent. But I always remind people, you talk to, a serious contemplative person, and they're like, that's one minor part of the transcendent story, right? Music is, if we all found the right music together, if we all sang together, it's choir, every time I talk about awe, people who are in choirs come up to me and are like crying, like, you gotta study choirs. I'm like, it's kind of hard, but go ahead, So let's not forget the other pathways.
Yeah, definitely. I remember Houston Smith, who is my friend. He was in my grandfather's Episcopal priest. Houston Smith
No way.
was in his congregation.
Wow.
But I remember him talking about he needed it once, and then in that moment, he saw its connection to just kind of like his ordinary religious practices.
Yeah.
Yeah, interesting. Okay, have you heard of the chaos narrative in chronic diseases? Okay, I'm going to put my glasses on because this person has good handwriting, but small handwriting. All right. Have you heard of the chaos narration in chronic disease where restitution isn't possible, creating a narrative for their suffering to storytell, embolden them, making us the physician, caregiver, listener?
Yeah, I think I understand the question, and it's a really important one, which is, was there end of life in that question?
It's about chronic disease.
Right. Yeah, when we confront mysteries, of chronic disease, why is my body decaying? Why am I dying? Why does a child die, et cetera? Why is there, racism and solitary confinement? The part of the lesson of the book and of awe is we look at this horror. It is horrifying, right? Body decay, that's horror. And the human mind interprets it and can come to many different interpretations. One of them is wonder and awe, like, well, why is this? And why is this part of the life cycle? What grows out of the end of life, et cetera? That tends to be a profile of awe. For others, it's horror, right? And there's no narrative. It's chaotic. You can't get out of the fact that you're leaving or that my body is decaying. And that's part of the human spectrum too, right? This is all on a continuum, and we make sense of it with that knowledge.
I mean, I think that's the most powerful part of the book is one we didn't even address, which is, your visits to San Quentin prison and how can experiences of awe help you in moments of terrible pain and crisis and despair. Being on death row where there's no possible future for you outside that environment. What do you do?
Yeah, and like my sister-in-law Susie here, I've always found moral beauty inside prisons and did a lot of work in them, and they taught me so much about awe because a lot of the men in there find awe in things I would struggle to find awe in, like the light off the bay, or just to be able to read. A lot of them can't find awe because it's too hard, right? It's too dehumanizing. And so we grapple with that as a society.
And that experience of awe leads to extraordinary creations too. I mean, I just think, I have a friend who is in prison, and I'm like, you're the last person I know who can actually concentrate because you're not getting a cell phone call all the time. Yeah. He's writing an opera. He's does beautiful art, visual art. Yeah. So there's some extraordinary examples of creativity happening.
It's astonishing. Humbling.
All right, so here's another question. A tale of ineffable awe. In May 2010, there was an accident. I was in an accident, hit on Market Street sidewalk, awakened in a general hospital from a near-death experience. I put my hand on my cheek, and it said, "All that is near, the light, the peace, the unity of all." So that was her experience. What about awe and near-death experiences? Please know I was unconscious at the crash site. I learned about this later. All right.
Yeah.
So, yeah, more about near-death experience.
Yeah. We, people write about it around the world, near-death experiences, in our 26-country study. One mom from Australia almost died giving birth and sort of hovered above the body, she was ready to go, and then she's like, oh my God, I got these 2 kids and this newborn, and she came back in. And I got really interested in the literature because I was watching my brother die. And I was like, what is his state of mind like as he heads into whatever is after? And so I read, there's a pretty robust new literature on it at the University of Virginia. And it's a Center for Psychonomics something, I can't remember the name. But near-death experiences, probably, there are kind of a couple of fascinating literatures on them. One is this historical literature where this historian actually analyzed, this is kind of morbid, I hope we don't end on this, but what do people do after they've been guillotined, you know? And like their head gets cut off, and you know, and then they did all these experiments, like slap their face, does the person still have emotion? And it was unclear what happens after you're guillotined. And I was like, wow, that's weird. But the real near-death experience literature, where people have these experiences, they've been reliably assessed. You know, they rock climb, they fall, they get into a car crash, heart attacks, strokes, they come back. And it is an ecstatic state, pretty reliably, of, you know, self-dissolving, space and time really changing, like awe, feeling of, you know, like you described in your experience of like, I'm surrounded by this warmth, right, that comes with a lot of awe experiences, and then light and so forth. And a sense of community around you. And that seems pretty reliable about where the mind goes. And I find it comforting that that's part of where we go.
Yeah. Will there be an Inside Out 2?
There is. It's coming. I know. I always get psychedelics in that question. It is coming.
So Inside Out was a film where Dacher was a consultant on about the emotional life of a teenager, and the different voices, the different emotions are characterized by different kind of individuals in her head.
Yeah, thanks. So Inside Out, you know, had 5 emotions in the first one. Riley, the main character, was 11. When Pete Docter, the director, asked me to talk to his team, which I did a lot of, he's like, well, we have 5 emotions. What other emotion would you add? I was like, awe, you know, she's 11, she's taking psychedelics, she's meditating, you know. They were like, no. No, I didn't say psychedelics. So, yeah, it's coming. It's got some really interesting emotions. I hope that awe, they are telling me that it has an interesting cameo, so we'll see.
Oh, this is a great question. What do you do to bring on a mystical experience?
I don't know.
Well, you know, it's funny. We have this.
What do you do?
Well, I'll tell you. We have everything we do is. I mean, the cathedral itself is designed for you to have a mystical experience. But we have this thing called grace light. We project this light from the ceiling 100 feet down, and you lie down on the floor, and you look up through this tunnel.
Yeah.
There's music and beautiful colors and shit. Exactly. Yeah. So when I talked to the creators of that, we were talking, how could you provoke a mystical experience? So that's our answer.
Yeah, and it's a really fundamental question, especially, you know, as I write about, like, for young people today, they don't go to church. It's really fading, you know, regrettably in some sense. And what I think the awe science tells us is we can find mysticism, however you feel it, in many places, and just bring that in, like churches do, to your life. So.
Yeah, last week we had, 60 young people come to Grace Cathedral for a Martin Luther King Jr. afternoon thing. It was amazing. Okay, here's another question. How can the church routines and rituals, for example, daily prayer, weekly going to church for wisdom and community, etc., inspire us to build habits that lead to more awe experience?
Yeah, that's a good one. What I hope you glean if you get the book and read it, and we have offerings on this too, and I'm working on it, is these 8 wonders are great pathways to awe. Music, I'm looking at Laura and Sarah, can always bring you awe. reading your sacred texts. When my brother died, I just went off on my own, and I just brought every sacred text, Darwin and Lao Tzu and Walt Whitman and Virginia Woolf, just like, sacred texts, walking with awe. Indigenous practices have so many orientations to the sky and to cloud. There's a cloud spotting society in England where you follow clouds. Go find it, right? And make it, it's interesting, awe turns out to be one of the easiest emotions to access, right? I hate that word access, but just to, there it is. I just stopped for a moment and looked at another person's eyes. It's always there. And so, I can give resources, read the book, find the sources where you feel mystical awe and bring them into your daily life.
Yeah. I can't believe it because the time just passes so quickly, but we have to have church soon, so we have to call it quits. The last question I wondered about, and maybe you can get back to me on this later too if you don't have time for it now, but I just wonder if this study of awe has changed you spiritually.
It did. It really, thank you for asking that. When I started writing the book, I began with Malcolm. And I hadn't thought about this till you asked that question. Yeah. And Malcolm's answer about mystical awe, we talked about Emerson and James and Margaret Fuller and all the traditions, was like this sense of space. I took it to be, of being with others and recognizing what's spirit. And as I went on this journey in India, and it's kind of a cliche, but that's what I felt. I felt like I was in this space, and my brother was still around in this quantum physical way. And that stays with me to this day, because I kept hearing him, almost like Emerson, like I heard him in winds, and I saw him in redwoods as he had red hair. I just felt him all around, merging with nature, which is why Emerson says, I will be a naturalist.
Right.
And
what I loved about the book, too, is you talk about feeling a sense of his touch on your shoulder.
Yeah.
Hearing his voice.
Yeah. Profoundly. Twice I felt his hand on my back. And I still feel that. And that changed my understanding of spirit, right? Which is like, we don't know. It's much bigger than how I think of human psyches. And I'm open to it.
Well, we're so grateful to having you here, and I do recommend that folks look at your book. I think we have books on sale today too. If I know you're fat, you can buy a copy of the book. You're welcome to join the service at 11 o'clock. And could you hear the men and boys choir practicing as we were talking? You're focusing on us.
Yeah.
But they sound great. So the men and boys choir, you have a chance to experience awe for yourself in half an hour. We rely on your support for the forum. Gifts of any size make a difference. You can give online at gracecathedral.org or by texting THINK, T-H-I-N-K, to 76278. Think to 76278. Dacher, I'm sad that our time is done, but I look forward to when our paths cross again and just hearing about some of your new collaborators and some of your future projects. Yeah. I know we're going to hear a lot more from you.
Good.
Yeah.
Well, it's great to be with you, Malcolm.
Yeah.